On January 31, 1943, at 06:15 hours, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus stood in the basement of the Univermag department store in Stalingrad, watching his staff officers burn the last operational maps. The concrete walls around him had absorbed 3 months of artillery fire. The men in this room represented what remained of the German Sixth Army, 91,000 soldiers who had marched into Russia with 550 tanks. Paulus had received intelligence reports 2 days earlier from Berlin. Soviet tank factories had produced more replacement vehicles in the previous 6 months than Germany's entire armored strength on the Eastern Front. The numbers seemed impossible. Germany had spent 2 decades building the most advanced armored force in military history. The Soviets had supposedly been crippled by Stalin's purges and the initial German advance. Yet somehow, Russian factories beyond the Ural Mountains were producing tanks at rates that exceeded Germany's total monthly output across all fronts. Paulus understood what those numbers meant. The Eastern Front was lost. The fighting would continue for another 28 months. Millions more would die. But the outcome had been decided by production lines in Chelyabinsk and Nizhny Tagil, by teenage girls operating lathes in factories that did not exist 18 months earlier, by a Soviet industrial mobilization so massive it defied rational calculation. The question that should have kept Hitler awake at night was simple. How did they do it? Germany entered the Soviet Union with the finest armored force ever assembled. 3,600 tanks supported by mechanized infantry, artillery, and close air support. The Panzer divisions had proven their effectiveness in Poland and France. German tank doctrine, developed over a decade, emphasized speed, concentration of force, and independent maneuver. Guderian, Rommel, and Manstein had refined these tactics into an operational art that overwhelmed opponents. Soviet armor in June 1941 outnumbered German tanks 4-1. The Red Army possessed 23,000 tanks, including models like the T-34 that were technically superior to most German designs. But numbers meant nothing without doctrine, training, and leadership. Stalin's purges had decimated the Soviet officer corps. Experienced tank commanders were dead or imprisoned. Tactical doctrine was rigid and outdated. Soviet tanks were dispersed across defensive positions rather than concentrated for mobile operations. The initial German advance destroyed Soviet armor wholesale. In the first 3 weeks of Operation Barbarossa, German forces claimed 3,000 Soviet tanks destroyed or captured. By December 1941, German after-action reports estimated 12,000 Soviet tanks eliminated. The victories seemed to confirm German superiority. Soviet armor was numerous but poorly employed, mechanical reliability was suspect, crews were inadequately trained, and command. Structures collapsed under German combined arms assaults. German intelligence officers in Berlin analyzed captured Soviet production data and concluded that Soviet tank production would decline significantly. German bombing had struck tank factories in Leningrad, Moscow, and Kharkov. The German advance had overrun industrial regions in Ukraine and Belarusia. Critical raw materials, manganese, nickel, coal, came from territories now under German control. The assessment concluded that Soviet tank production would fall to perhaps 200 vehicles per month by early 1942, insufficient to replace losses. That assessment was catastrophically wrong. In July 1941, as German panzer divisions approached Moscow, Soviet industrial planners began executing the largest industrial evacuation in history. 1,500 factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and shipped east beyond the Ural Mountains. The evacuation moved 217,000 railway cars of equipment, machine tools, blast furnaces, rolling mills, power generators. Everything necessary for heavy industry was transported 1,500 to 2,000 miles eastward to sites chosen for their inaccessibility to German bombers. Tank Factory No. 183 in Kharkov produced the T-34, the best Soviet tank design. German forces approached Kharkov in October 1941. Soviet authorities ordered the factory evacuated. Workers dismantled production lines, loaded machinery onto flatbed rail cars, and shipped everything to Nizhny Tagil in the Urals. The evacuation took 6 weeks. The factory arrived at a site that had no buildings, no power infrastructure, and winter temperatures reaching 40 degrees below zero. Workers assembled machinery outdoors in the snowstorms. They built walls around equipment using brick and timber scavenged locally. They powered machinery with temporary generators. The factory resumed production in December 1941, 8 weeks after the evacuation began. That timeline, 8 weeks from dismantling a factory to resuming production 1,500 miles away in winter conditions, demonstrated capabilities German planners had not anticipated. Soviet industrial mobilization operated under different assumptions than German industry. German tank production emphasized quality, precision engineering, and sophisticated mechanical systems. Factories employed skilled workers who spent years learning their trades. Production proceeded methodically because each tank required hundreds of hours of precision machining, careful assembly, and extensive testing. Soviet tank production emphasized speed, simplicity, and acceptance of imperfection. The T-34 was designed for mass production. Major components used simple shapes that could be cast or welded rather than machined. The hull was welded rather than riveted, reducing labor time. The engine, transmission, and suspension used existing designs from previous tank models, eliminating development time. The tank's sloped armor provided excellent protection without requiring thick steel plate. The 70-76 mm gun was adequate for defeating German armor at combat ranges. The design philosophy was clear: produce large numbers of adequate tanks quickly rather than small numbers of perfect tanks slowly. Factory number 183 at Nizhny Tagil implemented production methods that violated German engineering standards. Armor plates were cut by semi-skilled workers using templates and acetylene torches. Welds were functional but crude. Engine assembly used interchangeable parts that did not require precision fitting. Turrets were cast in single pieces rather than assembled from multiple components. Workers included women, teenagers, and elderly men who had minimal industrial experience. Training lasted 2 weeks. Workers learned specific tasks: cutting armor plate, welding hull sections, installing engines, rather than complete tank assembly. Specialization increased speed. The factory operated 24 hours daily in 3 shifts. There were no weekends, no holidays except May Day and Revolution Day. Workers lived in barracks adjacent to the factory. Food was brought to production lines. Medical care was provided on site. Everything was organized to maximize production hours. The first T-34 rolled off the Nizhny Tagil production line in December 1941. Production that month totaled 25 tanks. By February 1942, monthly production reached 125 tanks. By July 1942, the factory was producing 350 T-34s monthly. One factory, evacuated under emergency conditions, operating in temporary facilities, staffed by inexperienced workers, was producing more tanks monthly than Germany's largest tank factory. German intelligence received reports of Soviet production increases and assumed they were propaganda. 350 tanks monthly from a single factory seemed impossible. But reconnaissance aircraft photographed long columns of new tanks moving west from the Urals. Prisoners captured in 1942 reported entire tank brigades equipped with vehicles manufactured within the previous 8 weeks. The Germans confirmed what Berlin refused to believe. Soviet tank production was accelerating while German intelligence had predicted collapse. Germany produced 3,400 tanks in 1941. Soviet factories produced 6,700 tanks that same year, despite losing major industrial regions to German occupation. In 1942, German production increased to 6,100 tanks. Soviet production reached 24,000 tanks. The ratio had reversed. In June 1941, Germany had more tanks per capita production capacity than the Soviet Union. By December 1942, Soviet tank production exceeded German production by 4-1. The disparity grew more severe in 1943. Germany produced 5,900 tanks that year. The Soviets produced 24,000 tanks again. German production was essentially flat. Soviet production remained at maximum capacity. German industry was constrained by three fundamental problems: production capacity, raw materials, and design philosophy. Germany possessed fewer tank factories than needed for a total war production. Major manufacturers included Henschel, MAN, Daimler-Benz, and Krupp. All had experience building tanks, all employed skilled workers, all maintained high-quality standards, but none could match Soviet output. Henschel's factory in Kassel produced Tiger tanks, Germany's heaviest armored vehicle. The Tiger was formidable, 88mm gun, armor up to 120mm thick, virtually invulnerable to most Allied anti-tank weapons. Each Tiger required 300,000 man-hours to manufacture. Henschel produced 25 Tigers monthly at peak output. The entire German Tiger production from 1942 to 1945 totaled 1,383 vehicles. Soviet Factory No. 183 produced 1,383 T-34s in approximately 4 months. The comparison was not entirely fair because Tigers and T-34s served different roles, but the production differential illustrated Germany's fundamental problem. German tank designs emphasized sophisticated engineering that required time and skilled labor. The Tiger's overlapping road wheels provided excellent ride quality, but were difficult to manufacture and maintain. The precision machine transmission offered smooth shifting, but was fragile under combat stress. The Maybach engine delivered excellent power, but required high-grade fuel and frequent maintenance. The T-34 used simple designs throughout. The Christie suspension was crude, but reliable. The transmission was agricultural-grade robust. The diesel engine ran on low-grade fuel and required minimal maintenance. Soviet tankers reported that battlefield-damaged T-34s could often be repaired by crews using simple tools. German tankers reported that damaged Tigers required specialized recovery vehicles and factory-trained mechanics. The design philosophies reflected industrial realities. Germany had skilled workers, precision machinery, and high-quality steel, but limited quantities of each. Sophisticated tanks maximized the value of these scarce resources. The Soviet Union had unlimited unskilled labor, basic machinery, and adequate steel in enormous quantities. Simple tanks maximized production volume. German raw material constraints became critical by 1943. Tiger tanks required tungsten for armor-piercing ammunition, molybdenum for armor plate hardening, and nickel for transmission gears. All three materials came from sources increasingly unavailable as German-controlled territory shrank. Soviet tanks used chromium for armor hardening and conventional steel for most components. The Soviet Union possessed vast chromium deposits in the Urals, never threatened by German advances. German fuel production limited tank operations even when vehicles were available. Synthetic fuel plants produced sufficient gasoline for the Wehrmacht's needs in 1941 and 1942, but Allied bombing struck synthetic fuel production in 1943. By 1944, fuel shortages forced German panzer divisions to ration operations. New tanks sat immobile because no fuel existed for training or redeployment. Soviet fuel production expanded throughout the war. Oil fields in the Caucasus remained mostly beyond German reach after the Stalingrad defeat. American Lend-Lease provided high-octane aviation fuel and trucks to transport petroleum products. Soviet tank units never faced fuel constraints comparable to German shortages. The human dimension of Soviet tank production was as remarkable as the industrial statistics. Workers at Nizhny Tagil included 16-year-old girls operating lathes, 60-year-old men welding hull sections, and women who had been collective farm workers 6 months earlier learning to assemble transmissions. The workforce was housed in wooden barracks heated by inadequate stoves. Food was scarce: bread, thin soup, occasional potatoes. Workers received vodka rations when production quotas were exceeded. Medical care was minimal. Injuries from industrial accidents were common. Workers who collapsed from exhaustion were replaced immediately. The conditions were brutal by any peacetime standard, yet production never faltered. Workers understood that tanks were necessary for survival. German forces occupied territories where millions of Soviet citizens lived. Reports of atrocities filtered back to the factories. Workers knew their labor directly impacted whether families in occupied regions would survive. This created motivation that German factories, operating under less existential pressure, could not replicate. Soviet tank production included innovations that German industry should have adopted but resisted. Welding replaced riveting extensively in Soviet factories by 1942. Welding was faster, required less skilled labor, and produced stronger joints. German tank production retained riveting for many applications because German engineers distrusted welding quality. The T-34's cast turret was produced in single pieces using sand casting methods. German tanks used turrets assembled from multiple armor plates that required precision cutting, fitting, and welding. The Soviet approach was faster and ultimately produced adequate protection. Standardization proceeded further in Soviet factories than in German production. The T-34 went through several variants during the war, but changes were implemented across all production facilities simultaneously. When the T-34-85 appeared with an 85mm gun in 1944, all factories retooled within 3 months. Germany operated multiple tank types simultaneously: Panzer III, Panzer IV, Tiger, Panther, each requiring different spare parts, training programs, and maintenance procedures. This fragmented support systems and complicated logistics. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated the cumulative effect of Soviet industrial superiority. Germany assembled its largest armored concentration of the war: 2,700 tanks, including 300 Tigers and 200 Panthers. The offensive was intended to destroy Soviet armored reserves and regain initiative on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces defending the Kursk salient deployed 5,300 tanks, including 1,500 T-34s and 400 heavy KV-1 tanks. The numerical advantage was approximately 2-1 in Soviet favor, but the deeper story lay in replacement capacity. German forces lost approximately 760 tanks during the 2-week offensive. Those losses represented months of production from German factories already operating at maximum capacity. Soviet forces lost approximately 6,300 tanks during the same period, but replacement vehicles were arriving from factories at rates exceeding 1,800 tanks monthly. Soviet armored strength recovered within 8 weeks. German armored strength declined steadily after Kursk because losses exceeded production. The battle demonstrated another Soviet advantage: operational depth. Soviet doctrine accepted enormous casualties as acceptable costs for strategic objectives. Tank brigades were expended deliberately to fix German forces, while follow-on units maneuvered for counterattacks. German doctrine sought to preserve forces because replacements were scarce. This created asymmetric combat, where Soviet commanders could afford tactical defeats, while German commanders could not afford tactical losses. By 1944, Soviet tank production had created an insurmountable advantage. Germany produced 9,000 tanks in 1944, the highest total of the war. Soviet production reached 29,000 tanks. The ratio was greater than 3-1. Moreover, Soviet tanks were improving qualitatively. The T-34-85 matched German medium tanks in firepower and exceeded them in mobility. The IS-2 heavy tank mounted a 122mm gun capable of destroying any German armored vehicle at normal combat ranges. German responses were inadequate. The Panther tank was excellent technically. 75mm high-velocity gun, sloped armor, good mobility, but production never exceeded 300 monthly. Total Panther production was approximately 6,000 vehicles. Soviet factories produced 6,000 T-34s every 10 weeks. The Tiger II, Germany's ultimate heavy tank, mounted an 88mm gun with tremendous penetration and armor up to 180mm thick. Each vehicle required immense resources to produce. Total Tiger II production was 489 vehicles. Soviet IS-2 production exceeded 3,500 vehicles. Germany designed increasingly sophisticated tanks, while Soviet factories produced increasingly large numbers of adequate tanks. The German approach reflected engineering excellence. The Soviet approach reflected industrial pragmatism. In total war, pragmatism prevailed. The final collapse of German armored forces in 1945 resulted from accumulated production deficits. German panzer divisions that began the year with 150 tanks ended campaigns with 30 or 40 operational vehicles. Replacement tanks arrived slowly, or not at all. Spare parts were unavailable. Fuel was rationed to the point that training for new crews was impossible. Tank destroyers replaced tanks in many units because they were simpler to produce and required smaller crews. Soviet tank armies grew stronger as German resistance weakened. By April 1945, Soviet forces advancing on Berlin deployed 6,400 tanks. German forces defending Berlin possessed perhaps 700 operational tanks and assault guns. The numerical superiority was overwhelming, but more significant was the trajectory. Soviet tank strength was increasing through continuous production. German tank strength was evaporating through attrition without replacement. The production statistics tell the essential story. From 1941 through 1945, Germany produced approximately 27,000 tanks and assault guns. Soviet factories produced 96,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. The ratio was greater than 3.5 to 1. When combat losses are included, the disparity becomes even more pronounced. Germany lost essentially its entire tank production by 1945. The Soviets entered Berlin with armored forces larger than the total German tank production during the war. The lessons extended beyond numerical comparisons. Soviet industrial mobilization succeeded because it prioritized production volume over product sophistication, accepted harsh working conditions as necessary for survival, standardized designs ruthlessly to simplify manufacturing, relocated entire industries to protect them from enemy action, and employed workers regardless of traditional gender or age restrictions. German industrial production failed to match Soviet output because it maintained peacetime quality standards too long, protected skilled worker categories that limited workforce expansion, developed multiple competing designs that fragmented production, and failed to anticipate how quickly sophisticated designs could be matched by mass production of simpler alternatives. The human cost of Soviet tank production was immense. Workers died from industrial accidents, malnutrition, exposure, and simple exhaustion. Precise casualty figures for Soviet tank factory workers do not exist, but estimates suggest tens of thousands perished from causes directly related to factory conditions. The cost was considered acceptable because the alternative, German victory, meant national extinction. Germany never mobilized its population comparably. German factories maintained relatively normal working hours through 1943. Women were not conscripted for industrial labor until late in the war. Quality of life in German cities remained reasonable until Allied bombing intensified. The contrast was stark. Soviet workers lived in barracks and labored under conditions that would have caused riots in Germany. Yet Soviet production exceeded German output by ratios that determined the war's outcome. The title of this analysis suggests Germany built 1,100 tanks monthly, while Russia built 2,000 and never slowed down. The actual numbers varied by year, but the pattern holds. At peak production in 1944, German factories produced approximately 750 tanks monthly. Soviet factories produced approximately 2,400 tanks monthly during the same period. The 3-to-1 advantage proved decisive. Germany could not win a war of attrition against an opponent producing replacements faster than they could be destroyed. Field Marshal Paulus, surrendering at Stalingrad in February 1943, understood this reality. His army had been destroyed not by superior Soviet tactics, but by superior Soviet resources. The tanks that surrounded Stalingrad had been produced in factories that did not exist when the war began, crewed by soldiers trained in programs expanded beyond German capacity and fueled by industries beyond German reach. The outcome was determined by production capacity expressed through industrial output, measured in thousands of vehicles monthly. Germany possessed tactical excellence, operational sophistication, and technological innovation. The Soviet Union possessed factories that never stopped running, workers who never stopped welding, and a productive capacity that overwhelmed German advantages through sheer volume. That disparity determined the Eastern Front's outcome more certainly than any battle.